At 5:52 in the morning, on December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey called 911 from a house on 15th Street in Boulder, Colorado. Her daughter was missing. On the back staircase, she said she had found a note, 2.5 pages, written on a legal pad that belonged to the family. The note demanded $118,000, an unusually specific number, almost the exact amount of a bonus John Ramsey had received that year. The note was long enough that investigators would later note something strange about it. Most kidnappers, in genuine ransom cases, write fast, and they write short. This one didn't. 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey would be found dead in the basement of her own home less than 8 hours later. The ransom was never collected. No one was ever charged. And nearly 3 decades later, the case remains open. Not because there's nothing to go on, but because there's almost too much. Contradictions, a crime scene that investigators would later admit they mishandled from the first hour, a family that spent years under public suspicion without ever facing trial. This is not a story about who did it. This is a story about how an investigation can go wrong before it even begins, and what happens to the truth when it does. Boulder, Colorado, in December of 1996 was not a city that expected this. It was a university town, home to the flagship campus of the University of Colorado, framed by the Flatirons and the kind of civic identity that comes from being educated, affluent, and largely insulated from violent crime. Residents described a place where people left doors unlocked, a place people moved to specifically to raise children somewhere safe. JonBenét Ramsey was 53 years old. He had built Access Graphics, a computer technology reseller, into a company generating close to $1 billion in annual revenue by the mid-1990s. A business success that had made the family genuinely wealthy, and that would later become a strange, silent presence in the case itself. Since the ransom demand of $118,000 was so close to a bonus figure connected to his company that some investigators considered it too specific a number for a stranger to have guessed. John had 2 adult children from a first marriage, Melinda and John Andrew, and 2 young children with his second wife, Patsy, Burke, who was 9, and JonBenét, who was 6. Patsy Ramsey, 39 years old, had been Miss West Virginia in 1977 and a competitor in the Miss America pageant that same year. Friends and relatives described her consistently as warm, deeply devoted to her children, and organized to the point of intensity. The kind of mother who ran a household and a set of children's schedules with real discipline. 3 years before JonBenét's death, Patsy had been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. She underwent aggressive treatment and entered remission, an experience that, by multiple family accounts, reshaped how she thought about time with her children, and one that some who knew her have pointed to when trying to understand her devotion to activities like the pageant circuit that would later become such a public fixation. JonBenét, a name blended from her father's first and middle names, John Bennett, was by all accounts an unusually expressive, verbal child for her age. She had begun competing in children's beauty pageants around age 4, winning regional titles including Little Miss Colorado and America's Royale Miss. Photographs from those pageants, styled hair, stage makeup, sequined costumes built for children's competitive pageantry. A genre with its own established conventions across the American South and Midwest at the time. would go on to become some of the most reproduced images in the history of American crime coverage. It's worth pausing on that fact specifically because it matters for everything that follows. Those photographs did enormous work in shaping how the public understood this case before a single piece of forensic evidence had been publicly examined. They invited judgment about the family, about Patsy specifically, that had nothing to do with any evidence connecting anyone to a crime. A 6-year-old girl who competed in pageants became, within days, a 6-year-old girl whose death many strangers felt entitled to explain, based on nothing more than a photograph of her in a costume. Away from the pageant stage, those who knew JonBenét day to day described a different child than the one the public came to know through those images. Teachers at her school recalled a curious, energetic student. Neighbors recalled a girl who rode her bike on 15th Street, who liked being outside, who was, in the ordinary sense of the word, simply a 6-year-old, not yet old enough to have any real understanding of the public persona. A handful of pageant photographs would eventually attach to her name. Her older brother Burke, by classmates' accounts, was quiet and studious, close to his mother, and like JonBenét, entirely unaware in December of 1996 that his family's private life was about to become one of the most examined in the country. John Ramsey, for his part, was known in Boulder's business community primarily as a demanding but respected executive, someone who had built Access Graphics from a smaller regional operation into a company Lockheed Martin would acquire a stake in during the early 1990s. He traveled frequently for work. Patsy managed the household and the children's schedules largely on her own, a division of labor common enough among families of similar means at the time, but one that would later be scrutinized unfairly by most accounts, as though it were itself somehow suspicious. None of this, the pageants, the travel, the division of household labor, the family's wealth, constitutes evidence of anything. It is simply the ordinary texture of a family's life before the morning that ended it. But in the years that followed, each of these ordinary details would be picked up, examined, and reassembled by strangers into a story about who the Ramseys must have been, long before anyone with actual investigative authority had reached a documented conclusion about what happened inside that house. It's worth understanding, briefly, what that pageant circuit actually was, because the public imagination and the reality diverged sharply from one another. Children's pageantry in Colorado and across much of the American South and Midwest in the mid-1990s was an established, if niche, activity. Regional competitions, often held in hotel conference rooms and community centers, judged on categories that included personality, poise, and appearance, with mothers frequently handling hair, wardrobe, and coaching themselves rather than hiring professionals. It was not, by the standards of the industry itself, unusual for a 6-year-old to compete, and it was not on its own indicative of anything unusual about a family beyond a shared interest in an activity that thousands of families across the country participated in without incident, year after year. None of that context made it into the earliest wave of national coverage. What made it into that coverage were still images selected for maximum visual impact, stripped of the mundane reality of a Saturday afternoon competition in a hotel ballroom, and repeated so often on so many channels that within weeks they had effectively replaced any other visual reference the public had for who JonBenét Ramsey actually was. On the night of December 25th, 1996, the Ramseys hosted a small holiday gathering at their own home, then drove to the house of close friends, Fleet and Priscilla White, for Christmas dinner. The White's children and the Ramsey children played together that evening. The families had known each other for years. The Ramseys returned home a little after 9:30 p.m. Patsy put JonBenét, who had fallen asleep in the car, to bed without waking her fully. Burke was already down for the night. John Ramsey later said he read for a short while before going to sleep himself. By every account gathered afterward, it was an ordinary end to a good holiday, in a house the family had lived in for roughly 18 months. A large, somewhat labyrinthine home with multiple staircases, a finished basement, and rooms that even close family friends did not fully know the layout of. That detail, the house's own complexity, would matter more than anyone expected by morning. The house itself deserves description because its layout became a recurring subject in the investigation for years afterward. It was a large, older home, built in stages, with a main staircase and a separate, narrower spiral staircase connecting the kitchen area to the upper floors. The basement was partially finished, partially used for storage, and included a small room, accessible through a door that did not lock from the inside, that the family referred to as the wine cellar, a space few visitors to the house, even close friends, could have located without prior familiarity with the home. There was also a broken window well in the basement, near a train room used by Burke, that investigators photographed early on, and that would go on to fuel one of the case's most persistent theories, that an intruder had entered and later left through that specific point of access. Whether that window had been broken before or during the events of that night was never conclusively established, and the debate over it, genuine forensic ambiguity, or a detail too convenient to be coincidental, became, in its own right, one of the case's defining unresolved questions. Patsy Ramsey woke just before 5:30 on the morning of December 26th, intending to get an early start on packing for a family trip. She would later say that on her way down the spiral staircase toward the kitchen, she saw 3 sheets of paper resting on one of the middle steps. It was the ransom note, handwritten, in what forensic examiners determined was likely a felt-tip pen belonging to the household, on a pad of paper from inside the house. Both items were eventually traced to material already present in the home, meaning whoever wrote the note did not need to bring anything with them to do it. The note ran 2.5 pages, addressed John Ramsey directly by name, referenced his business and his approximate net worth, demanded $118,000 in specific denominations, instructed him not to involve police or the FBI, and threatened that JonBenét would be beheaded if the instructions were not followed. It was signed with the initials SBTC, a signature that has never been definitively linked to any individual, organization, or established meaning, despite decades of speculation. Patsy Ramsey did not call 911 immediately upon finding the note. By her account, she ran to JonBenét's room, found it empty, then woke John, and the two of them searched portions of the house before Patsy placed the call. The call came in at 5:52 a.m. It lasted just over a minute. On the recording, Patsy can be heard telling the dispatcher that her daughter had been kidnapped and that there was a ransom note. Near the end of the call, Before hanging up, something can be heard in the background, a fragment of sound that forensic audio analysts have examined for decades without full agreement on what it actually captures or whether it holds any evidentiary meaning at all. Boulder police arrived within several minutes. What happened over the following hours would become the foundation of nearly every criticism leveled at the investigation for the next 3 decades. Responding officers, reasonably, treated the case initially as an active kidnapping. Standard protocol in an ongoing kidnapping is different from protocol at a homicide scene. The priority becomes keeping the household functional in case a ransom call comes in, not sealing the property as a crime scene. Friends of the family, including Fleet and Priscilla White, whom Patsy had called before dialing 911, arrived at the house and were allowed inside. A pastor arrived. Coffee was made in the kitchen. People moved freely through rooms, including rooms that would later be identified as central to the case. Critically, the basement, including the small storage room known in the house as the wine cellar, was not searched thoroughly by police in those early hours. One officer did walk through parts of the basement that morning and reported nothing unusual, a fact that has been scrutinized ever since JonBenét's body was in that room the entire time. At around 1 p.m., more than 7 hours after the initial call, and with no ransom contact having come in. Itself an anomaly in a genuine kidnapping for ransom case, since kidnappers who leave detailed pickup instructions typically follow through with contact. A Boulder detective asked John Ramsey and Fleet White to walk through the house one more time, room by room, to check whether anything seemed out of place. That task, in a properly managed homicide investigation, is performed by trained crime scene personnel. On this morning it was assigned to the victim's own father and a family friend. John Ramsey went down into the basement. He opened the door to the wine cellar, a small room used for storage. He found his daughter there. JonBenét was on the floor. A blanket lay partially over her body. A cord was wound around her neck, tied to the broken handle of an artist's paintbrush, forming a garrote, assembled from materials already present in the house, including a paintbrush from Patsy's own art supplies. Duct tape covered her mouth. Her wrists showed evidence of having been bound with cord, though one wrist restraint appeared loosely applied or possibly self-removed. John Ramsey picked his daughter's body up and carried her upstairs, laying her on the living room floor before anyone could stop him. That single instinctive act, a father lifting his child's body from where he'd found her, has been discussed by forensic experts for years, not as an accusation, but as a documented, understandable event that permanently altered the crime scene. The position of the body, the exact configuration of the restraints, trace evidence that might have remained undisturbed in that room. All of it was compromised in the moment John Ramsey did what almost any parent's body would do before their mind fully caught up. The Boulder County coroner's autopsy, conducted the following day, determined the cause of death to be asphyxiation caused by strangulation, with a significant skull fracture caused by a blunt force blow to the head. Forensic pathologists who reviewed the findings differed then and later on the exact sequence and timing of the 2 injuries, whether the head trauma occurred first, rendering JonBenét unconscious before the ligature was used, or whether the sequence ran differently. The distinction matters because it speaks to intent, and to how much time elapsed during the assault, but it has never been resolved with full certainty. The autopsy also documented evidence in the genital area consistent with both acute and, more controversially, some past irritation. Findings that different medical examiners, testifying and writing publicly over the following 2 decades, have interpreted in materially different ways. Some read the evidence as indicating a single acute assault at the time of death. Others suggested a longer pattern that was never independently corroborated by any other witness, medical record, or report during JonBenét's life. No consensus among the forensic pathologists who have reviewed this case over the years has ever been reached, and it remains one of the most contested medical questions in the file. The physical evidence collected that day was, in some respects, unusually rich for a case of this kind. Fibers, hair samples, the cord and tape used in the assault, the pad of paper and pen used to write the note, and biological material recovered from the body itself. In other respects, it was already compromised beyond full recovery. Given how many people had moved through the house before any of it was formally documented and secured, forensic scientists who reviewed the case in later years have generally agreed on this dual reality. The Ramsey case left behind more raw physical evidence than most unsolved murders ever do, and at the same time, the conditions under which that evidence was collected fell well short of what a case of this magnitude required from the very first hour. By the time investigators fully grasped the scope of what they were working with, the scene had already been walked through by 6 people who had no forensic role there. The ransom note sat, waiting, the money for it never collected, because the kidnappers, it seemed, had never actually planned to collect it, or had never existed in the form the note implied at all. Boulder, Colorado, in 1996 had a police department built for the crimes a college town actually produces. Burglary, vandalism, alcohol-related incidents, the occasional assault. In the 5 years preceding JonBenét Ramsey's death, the Boulder Police Department had investigated 0 homicides. That inexperience shaped nearly every decision made in the first days of the case, and many of the decisions made for years afterward. Detective Linda Arndt was the lead investigator on scene the morning of December the 26th. In interviews given years later, she stated she had begun to suspect, almost immediately, that the ransom note itself didn't read the way an authentic kidnapping note typically does. It was long, when genuine ransom notes are almost always short, composed quickly, under pressure, by someone who wants to complete a crime and leave. This note ran nearly 3 pages, contained language some analysts later noted bore resemblance to lines from popular films, including the 1994 film Speed, and demanded a sum that, while large to an average family, was strikingly modest for a target as wealthy as John Ramsey. Inconsistent, some profilers argued, with a professional kidnapping operation that had clearly done research on the family's finances. But suspicion is not evidence, and Boulder police, by numerous later accounts, including internal reviews commissioned by the department itself, were not prepared, procedurally or experientially, to run a homicide investigation of this complexity. The failures compounded quickly. The property was not properly secured as a crime scene in the earliest hours. Witnesses and family friends who had been in the house together for an extended period were not separated for individual contemporaneous statements before they'd had the chance to discuss what they'd seen with one another. Physical evidence was collected from a scene that had already seen substantial foot traffic, complicating chain-of-custody arguments that would surface at trial, had any trial ever happened. John and Patsy Ramsey themselves were not formally interviewed by police, individually and with legal representation, until nearly a month after their daughter's death, a delay attorneys and investigators on both sides of the case have since criticized, since early, less rehearsed statements are generally considered more forensically valuable than statements given after a month of legal preparation. Several outside consultants who reviewed the Boulder Police Department's handling of the case in later years pointed to a specific structural problem beyond any individual officer's judgment. The department simply had no established homicide protocol to fall back on. Larger departments in cities with regular homicide caseloads typically have standing procedures, checklists, designated roles, immediate scene lockdown, regardless of the crime's apparent nature, precisely because those procedures remove the need for split-second judgment calls under chaotic, emotionally charged circumstances. Boulder had none of that infrastructure in place because it had never needed it before. The result was an investigation built, in its opening hours, on improvisation rather than protocol. And improvisation, in a case this complex, left gaps that better-resourced departments might have closed before they ever opened. There were procedural missteps beyond the scene itself. Investigators did not immediately establish a clear, documented timeline, separating what each person present in the house that morning had seen and when. Search warrants for the property were, by some accounts, slower to secure than the case's complexity warranted, given early indications that this was not a genuine stranger abduction, and the department's small size, a handful of detectives, in a city unaccustomed to homicide investigations of any kind, let alone one that would become one of the most scrutinized cases in American history, meant that from nearly the first day, Boulder police were operating well outside the boundaries of their institutional experience, a fact several outside law enforcement consultants noted at the time, and that an independent review commissioned years later would substantially confirm. By early January of 1997, less than 2 weeks after the murder, anonymous police sources had already begun telling reporters that the Ramseys themselves were the central focus of the investigation. No indictment, no formal charge, just leaks filtered through tabloid and cable coverage that was, by this point, covering the case around the clock. That leak did something that proved almost impossible to undo. Boulder became the site of one of the largest crime media events of the decade. The pageant photographs ran daily, often looping on a continuous cycle across cable news chyrons, stripped of any context about children's pageantry as an established, if controversial, activity practiced by thousands of families across the country at the time. Handwriting experts appeared on cable news comparing samples live on air, offering confident conclusions in 3-minute segments about a document that professional forensic examiners, working for years with the actual physical evidence, could never fully agree on. Patsy Ramsey's public composure at press conferences was dissected moment by moment as either grief or performance, depending entirely on which network was airing the segment and which narrative that network's audience had already been primed to expect. Tabloid publications ran cover stories on the case for months. The family's finances, their marriage, Patsy's pageant background, Even the specific brand of clothing JonBenét had been dressed in for competitions all became material for public speculation about a child's death that had nothing to do with any of it. A book published in 2000, JonBenét, The Inside Story, by journalist Lawrence Schiller, offered one of the more detailed contemporaneous accounts of the investigation's internal dysfunction, drawing on extensive access to investigators, prosecutors, and the Ramseys themselves. But even that account, widely cited by researchers since, could not settle the case's central question. The family had buried their daughter before the new year began, and within days they were, in practical terms, already being tried by an audience that had never seen a single piece of physical evidence, working instead from photographs, leaked fragments of the ransom note, and the particular, unfamiliar cadence of a mother's grief performed in front of television cameras she had not chosen to be standing in front of. What got lost in that noise was a more uncomfortable, less satisfying fact. The Boulder Police Department had made a series of documented errors in the first 24 hours, errors that a properly staffed, experienced homicide unit likely would not have made, and that may have permanently limited what the physical evidence could ever prove about anyone. Whoever wrote that note, whoever assembled that garrote from items already inside the house, had time that morning. Time the investigation, in its earliest and most critical hours, did not use well enough to keep pace with. In the weeks that followed, investigators did pursue leads beyond the family, though these efforts received far less public attention than the scrutiny aimed at John and Patsy. Linda Hoffman Pugh, the family's housekeeper, was investigated and later cleared. She had notably once told Patsy Ramsey that if she ever needed money quickly, she should consider a scenario resembling a kidnapping, a comment that, once it surfaced, understandably drew investigative interest, though nothing tied her directly to the crime itself. Bill McReynolds, a man who had played Santa Claus at the Ramseys' Christmas gathering that year, was also investigated and cleared, along with several other individuals connected to the family's social and professional circles over the following years. None of these threads produced physical evidence linking anyone to the scene. What they did produce, cumulatively, was a portrait of an investigation that cast a reasonably wide net early on, then narrowed almost entirely onto the Ramsey family by early 1997, a narrowing that a number of investigators involved in the case would later say happened too quickly and with too little forensic justification, given what the physical evidence actually showed at the time. By the spring of 1997, the case against the family, so much of the public had already convicted in the press, was, on the actual evidentiary record, thin. There was no physical evidence directly placing John or Patsy Ramsey at the scene of the assembly of the garrote or the composition of the note, beyond handwriting analysis that the experts hired by both police and the defense disagreed on throughout the case. Several forensic document examiners could not conclusively match the handwriting to Patsy Ramsey, and some stated directly that key characteristics suggested she likely did not write it, while others reached less definitive conclusions. There was, notably, biological evidence. Unidentified male DNA recovered from JonBenét's underwear and from beneath her fingernails. The DNA did not match John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, or anyone within the family circle who submitted samples for testing in the years that followed. In the public narrative of the time, this fact was frequently minimized. Treated as a secondary curiosity, rather than as evidence that, on its face, pointed away from the family under suspicion. A Boulder County grand jury was convened in September of 1998, nearly 2 years after the murder. It heard testimony and evidence for 13 months, one of the longest grand jury proceedings in Colorado's history. In October of 1999, that grand jury voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey on 2 counts, each of child abuse, resulting in death, a charge under Colorado law that does not require proof of intent to kill. Then Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter made a decision the public would not learn about for 14 years. Hunter declined to sign the indictments. Under Colorado law, without a district attorney's signature, an indictment cannot move forward to prosecution. At the time, Hunter told the public only that his office lacked sufficient evidence to secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, a legitimate and legally defensible standard, but one that omitted the far more significant fact that a jury of the Ramseys' own community had already reviewed the case and voted otherwise. That fact, that an indictment had actually been voted and then set aside by a single elected official, was not confirmed publicly until 2013, when the Boulder Daily Camera successfully sued to unseal the grand jury's records. For 14 years, the American public was allowed to believe simply that the Ramseys had never been charged. Technically accurate, but stripped of the deeper context. That citizens who had reviewed the actual evidence at length over more than a year had concluded there was enough to bring charges and that a prosecutor had overridden them. The investigation itself was not unified in its conclusions, even internally. Steve Thomas, a Boulder detective who had worked the case closely in its first 2 years, resigned from the department in 1998 and subsequently wrote a book, JonBenét, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, arguing that Patsy Ramsey had been responsible for her daughter's death, and that political pressure from the district attorney's office had prevented the case from moving forward. His account stood in direct public conflict with that of Lou Smith, a veteran homicide investigator brought onto the case by the district attorney's office specifically for his experience, who reviewed the same evidence and reached the opposite conclusion, that the physical evidence pointed toward an unknown intruder, not the family. Smith resigned from the case in 1998 as well, but for the opposite reason. He felt the investigation was too focused on the Ramseys and not focused enough on evidence he believed pointed elsewhere. He continued working the case privately, at his own expense, until his death in 2010, remaining convinced until the end that the Ramseys were innocent. 2 experienced investigators, working from the same case file, reached conclusions that could not both be true. That perhaps more than any single piece of evidence captures how genuinely unresolved this case became at its core. Not a matter of the public simply refusing to accept an obvious answer, but a case where trained professionals, examining identical evidence, arrived at opposite conclusions and never reconciled them. Alex Hunter, the district attorney whose decision not to sign the grand jury's indictments would remain hidden from the public for 14 years, retired from office in 2001 without ever publicly explaining his reasoning in detail. He died in 2021. In the years between his retirement and his death, he gave few interviews about the case, and none that fully addressed why he chose not to move forward despite a jury's vote. That silence, more than almost any single document in the case file, has remained one of its most persistent, open questions. not what the evidence showed, which is at least partially a matter of public record, but why the one person with the legal authority to act on a jury's own conclusion chose not to, and never fully said why. This is the deepest institutional failure in the case. Not one dramatic act of misconduct, but a slow accumulation of smaller ones. A crime scene compromised in its first hours by a department with no homicide experience, leaks to the press that shaped public opinion before any legal process had run its course. A documented, reported tension between the Boulder Police Department and the District Attorney's Office. The two agencies reportedly clashing at points over investigative direction and over how aggressively to pursue the Ramseys as suspects, according to reporting from journalists who covered the case closely, including Lawrence Schiller's extensive account of the investigation's internal politics, and finally, a grand jury's actual findings withheld from public knowledge for over a decade, while the family whose case they concerned lived under a presumption of guilt the legal system itself had, apparently, already begun to move beyond behind closed doors. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer on June 24, 2006, at age 49, nearly 10 years after her daughter's death. She died having never been formally charged with any crime. She also died without the public, or by most accounts even Patsy herself, knowing with certainty that a Colorado grand jury had once voted to indict her, and that decision had been quietly set aside. In August of 2006, 2 months after Patsy Ramsey's death, a 41-year-old former elementary school teacher named John Mark Carr was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand. Carr had spent months emailing a University of Colorado journalism professor, Michael Tracy, who had reported extensively on the case for years. In those emails, Carr eventually confessed, in explicit, detailed language, to killing JonBenét Ramsey, describing her death as accidental, the result, in his account, of drugging her before the situation escalated. For roughly a week in late August 2006, it appeared to much of the American public that the case had finally, factually, broken open. Boulder authorities coordinated Carr's extradition from Thailand. His return to American soil was covered, live, with the kind of rolling network coverage typically reserved for national emergencies. Then came the detail that unraveled everything within days. DNA testing confirmed that Carr's genetic profile did not match the unidentified male DNA recovered from the crime scene a decade earlier. Beyond the DNA mismatch, investigators found that Carr's account of the night contained factual errors about the house, about the sequence of events, and about details that anyone with first-hand knowledge of the crime scene should have known. Within weeks, Boulder prosecutors dropped all charges against him. It emerged that Carr had a documented history of inserting himself, falsely, into other unrelated child murder investigations, a pattern of false confession behavior that mental health professionals have studied as its own distinct phenomenon. He was, ultimately, established to have had no connection to JonBenét Ramsey's death at all. But that week, the week much of the country believed the case had been solved by a confessed killer, did something that a decade of tabloid suspicion aimed at the Ramseys had never fully managed to accomplish. It forced a second look. Because if a stranger with no connection to the family could confess in such graphic, confident, specific detail to a murder he did not commit, and be believed, if only briefly, by trained investigators, extradition authorities, and international media simultaneously, then the entire structure of certainty that had been built around the Ramsey family for 10 years deserved exactly the same scrutiny that had just unraveled Carr's story in a matter of days. The unidentified male DNA that didn't match John Mark Carr was the same profile that had never matched anyone in the Ramsey family either. It had been sitting in an evidence file since 1997. Investigators had had it the entire time. In July of 2008, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey issued a formal, written statement addressed directly to John Ramsey, apologizing on behalf of her office. Advances in what forensic scientists call touch DNA analysis, a technique that did not exist with sufficient sensitivity in 1997, allowed analysts to retest the original DNA evidence recovered from JonBenét's clothing. The results confirmed a single consistent male DNA profile present in multiple locations on the clothing, a pattern that Lacey's office stated was, in their professional judgment, inconsistent with incidental or innocent transfer, and consistent instead with the presence of an unknown assailant. Lacey's letter stated plainly that the Ramsey family was cleared of involvement in JonBenét's death, and that the DNA evidence pointed toward an unidentified intruder. By the time that letter arrived, Patsy Ramsey had been dead for 2 years. She never read it. John Ramsey has said, in interviews given in the years since, that the fact still sits with him more than almost anything else about the case. That his wife spent the final decade of her life as a publicly suspected child murderer in the eyes of a significant portion of the country, and that the formal confirmation of what the DNA evidence suggested came only after she was no longer alive to hear it. Burke Ramsey was 9 years old in December of 1996. He grew into adolescence and adulthood as an ongoing subject of internet speculation, message board theorizing, and in 2016 the focus of a CBS documentary series that publicly suggested he may have been involved in his sister's death, a claim Burke Ramsey has consistently, forcefully denied. He sued CBS for defamation. The network settled the case out of court in 2019 on terms that were not disclosed publicly, but which followed a Michigan judge's ruling that some of the documentary's claims did not meet the evidentiary standard required for the network's expert conclusions. No public evidence has ever resulted in charges against Burke Ramsey. The family retained prominent attorney L. Linwood for years, specifically to fight cases like the CBS documentary, and to respond to the wave of civil litigation and public accusation the family faced repeatedly, even after being formally cleared. John Ramsey has described those legal battles, collectively, as almost a second, parallel ordeal, running alongside the grief of losing his daughter, and later, his wife. Years spent defending his surviving son and his own name in courtrooms and in the press, against claims that were never substantiated by physical evidence, but that nonetheless followed the family publicly for decades. What this family experienced across nearly 3 decades resists the usual language of true crime storytelling. They were never convicted of anything. 2 of them were formally, publicly, cleared by DNA evidence in writing by the very office that once presented a grand jury with evidence to indict them. And yet, for a significant share of the American public, the Ramsey name remains reflexively linked to guilt, an association built not on any verdict, but on leaked suspicion, tabloid saturation, and the sheer unresolved duration of a case that never reached a courtroom. John Ramsey, now in his early 80s, has spent much of the last 2 decades advocating publicly for the case to be reopened using modern forensic technology. He has testified before the U.S. Congress in support of legislation funding cold case DNA and genetic genealogy programs nationwide. Across interviews spanning almost 30 years, his stated goal has remained consistent and by any measure modest: to know who killed his daughter and to see that person identified before he himself is no longer alive to hear it. He remarried in 2011 to Jean Rousseau and has continued to live by his own description, with the case as a permanent, unresolved presence in his life, not something he has been able to set down, even decades later, even after formal clearance, even after burying both his wife and his daughter. In multiple interviews, he has said the hardest part was never the public suspicion itself, difficult as that was to endure, but the simpler, quieter fact underneath it, that he still does not know with certainty what happened in his own house that night, or who was responsible. Every parent who loses a child carries that loss forward. Far fewer are asked to carry it forward while also being investigated for it, cleared of it, and then made to watch the case go unsolved regardless. Melinda and John Andrew Ramsey, John's children from his first marriage, have spoken publicly far less often than their father, but have consistently supported his account of events and pushed, alongside him, for continued forensic testing. The extended Ramsey family, across 2 generations now, has effectively spent 30 years as both grieving relatives and unwilling public figures, a dual role almost no family volunteers for, and one that this case, more than most, forced on people who had no evidentiary connection to the crime that defined the rest of their lives. Burke Ramsey, now in his late 30s, has largely avoided public life since the 2019 settlement with CBS, giving only rare interviews. Those who have spoken with him describe someone who has spent most of his adult life trying to build an ordinary existence in the shadow of a childhood tragedy the entire country has an opinion about, despite having no formal connection to it beyond having been a 9-year-old boy asleep in the same house that night. As of 2026, the murder of JonBenét Ramsey remains officially unsolved and remains an open case within the Boulder Police Department's files. Investigators have periodically confirmed ongoing forensic review, including forensic genetic genealogy, the same category of investigative technique that has resolved numerous decades-old cold cases across the United States in recent years by comparing crime scene DNA against public genealogical databases, even in cases with far less biological evidence available than exists in this one. In late 2024, Netflix released a documentary series revisiting the case in detail, drawing renewed public and media attention nearly 30 years after the murder. Following its release, John Ramsey again publicly called for the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to take primary control of DNA testing in the case, citing what he has described across multiple public statements as decades of insufficient follow-through and technological delay on the part of the Boulder Police Department. Specifically, Boulder Police, in response to renewed attention, issued statements confirming the case remains open and that advanced genetic genealogy techniques are being actively applied to the existing, preserved DNA profile from the case. As of this recording, no arrest has been announced, and no individual has been publicly named as a confirmed suspect based on the DNA evidence. The ransom note itself, the one that ran too long for a genuine kidnapping, that demanded an amount too specific to be a stranger's guess, that was written using a pen and paper already inside the house by someone who evidently had the time to sit and compose nearly 3 full pages while a 6-year-old's body waited in a room below, remains one of the most extensively analyzed documents in the history of American criminal investigation. It has been examined by forensic linguists, certified handwriting examiners, FBI behavioral profilers, and in the Internet era, by thousands of amateur researchers poring over scanned images of its pages. No consensus on its author has ever been publicly reached. John Ramsey continues to hope that person will one day be identified, not for a headline, and not for a verdict that could still technically be delivered against someone decades later, but so that the actual documented story of what happened in that house on the morning after Christmas, 1996, no longer has to compete for space with the version so many people decided to believe in the days before any of the evidence was ever public. Colorado, notably, has no statute of limitations on murder, meaning that whoever is eventually identified through the surviving DNA evidence could, in theory, still face prosecution decades after the fact, a possibility that keeps this case categorically different from many other cold cases, where the passage of time has closed off any legal path to accountability, even if a name is finally attached to the evidence. Forensic genetic genealogy, the technique now being applied to the case, works by comparing an unknown DNA profile against public genealogical databases to identify likely relatives, then narrowing a family tree until a specific individual emerges. The same method that resolved California's Golden State Killer case in 2018, nearly 40 years after those crimes were committed. Boulder police have not stated publicly how far that process has progressed in the Ramsey case, or whether any partial matches have been identified, citing the ongoing nature of the investigation. Genetic genealogy in cold cases typically requires a DNA sample of sufficient quality and quantity to build a usable profile for database comparison, a technical bar that degraded or limited quantity evidence from a 30-year-old case does not always clear, even when the underlying DNA profile itself has long been established. Whether the Ramsey case evidence meets that bar has not been confirmed publicly and remains, like so much else in this file, information the public has been asked to wait for. For nearly 30 years now, that has been the state of the case. Preserved evidence, an available and increasingly powerful set of forensic tools, and a family that has spent 3 decades being simultaneously the most publicly scrutinized and the most definitively cleared people connected to an American murder case that remains on paper entirely unsolved. Boulder, Colorado, has changed considerably since 1996. The house on 15th Street has changed owners more than once. New residents have had to live, knowingly or not, in a home that remains, to this day, one of the most photographed crime scenes in American history. Its address still findable, still occasionally visited by people who drive past, simply to look. A note, longer than it needed to be. A ransom that was never collected. A house that was never properly secured in the hours it mattered most. And a family that spent the rest of their lives being investigated by strangers with television sets and settled opinions, long after the trained investigators closest to the case had quietly moved past them. JonBenét Ramsey, was 6 years old. Whatever else this case became, a media spectacle, a cultural fixation, a Rorschach test for whatever people already believed about wealth, about mothers, about pageants, about families that look a certain way on television. She was, first and simply, a child, asleep in her own bed, in her own house, before midnight, on Christmas. Somewhere, the person who wrote that note still knows exactly what happened next. Somewhere, the DNA under her fingernails belongs to someone who has lived an entire additional life since that morning. Worked jobs, maybe raised children of his own, maybe walked past a news segment about this case at some point over the last 30 years, without anyone in the room ever knowing what he was looking at. The rest of us are still waiting for the file to catch up to the truth. This has been Dead Ends. If this case affected you, there are always more that were never truly closed. Subscribe, and we'll bring you the next one.